Yeah, I'll start by going through some GCSE 8-mark questions, but yeah, please do interrupt me if you have questions or you want to clarify something or you want to tell me I'm wrong about something that entirely could happen. I'm not an examiner. I don't have any affiliation to marking, so this is just from my experience. So I thought we'd look at basically what 8-mark questions look like and then decide how what is being required of the students first. So I've got some examples of recent questions. So the 4 that I'm going to put up are from last year. So the first one, how does Medea show her anger and bitterness at Jason's marriage? How does Virgil make the death of Priam particularly sad and shocking? How does Tacitus convey the powerful emotions of the people after the death of Germanicus? And how does Caesar convey the difficulties facing the Romans in this passage? So what we can see here is they are all how questions. So they're taking a passage of the text and then asking you to do some analysis of the language of how that conveys a certain effect. You're also given 2 bullet points to help the student structure that. And it says at the bottom, you should refer to the Latin and discuss the author's use of language. So that is what you're being asked to do. And all those questions you can see are really quite similar. So if you then look at the mark scheme for what you have to do for the 8-mark response, I never think these mark schemes are particularly helpful because band 4, very good engagement with the question, band 3, good engagement with the question. I mean, distinguishing when you're trying to mark something with what is very good and what is good is not always easy. So you can see the first thing you have to do is you've got to answer the question. So if the students are giving points, they may be really good points about the text, but if they are not actually answering the question, then they're not going to be in a top band. Expresses a range of relevant points versus sound points. I think the word relevant is quite interesting. With good development versus with some development. In other words, are they just writing a little bit of explanation or are they really going into detail? Drawn a range of well-selected versus relevant aspects of content and features of literary style. So well-selected, they've really chosen the best possible thing to talk about. With a good range versus with a range. So they've made a sufficient number of points of appropriate quotation with well thought out discussion versus sound discussion. So again, the difference between band 4 and band 3 is it really relevant? Is it really detailed? And are they saying something genuinely quite interesting or just decent? I also thought it was interesting that on the mark schemes for the latest past papers, they've got this bit of guidance here. For full credit, a point must answer the question. I mean, that seems a bit obvious to me, but not often to the students. i.e. plausible explanation of how the point makes the scene vivid and dramatic, or whatever the question is. And that's actually where the students find it the most difficult, is actually saying how the point they're making answers the question. They must quote from the Latin, so every point needs to have a Latin quote. They must give a clear indication of the meaning of the Latin. So everything that they quote, I mean, the easiest way of doing that is just they translate it. Allow relevant content or style points. So not every point they make has to be a really in-depth style point. They can just talk about what is in the text. Do not give full credit for undeveloped points referring to, e.g., harsh consonants, sibilants, promotion, asyndeton, short phrases. So I always find there's always a subsect of students who thinks, I'm going to talk about sibilants. I'm going to use the word sibilants or asyndeton or polyptoton. And therefore, the very fact that I've said this word means that I'm going to get marks for it. And then they don't explain it. So this is basically saying, don't do that. Give partial credit for a second point based on the same Latin quotation. That's, yeah, pretty obvious. So drawing from what you've actually got from the exam board, what does this mean you're required to do for 8-mark questions? They need to answer the question, make relevant points on content and style, choose good short quotations to support their points and translate the quotation. So they can't just refer to the Latin and then expect their point to make sense without some indication of what their Latin means. Develop those points with full explanation of how and or why. Some kind of structure is needed, but there's nothing that says they need an intro or conclusion. They need to really cover the whole passage. If it's 8 lines long and they're making 4 points from, the first 3 lines, they're really not covering the passage. And to not rely on technical literary jargon to do the work. So that's all what they need to do. This is what I would say for how they should do it. I'm sure you've all come across P or PEAL, point, evidence, explanation. I always like to have the link to the question so that to make sure that they know that their points are relevant. And for Latin, as opposed to say class civ, I tend to use PETAL, point, evidence, translation, analysis being the same as explanation, and link to question. And the students will probably be very familiar from English and history and whatever with P or PEAL. So PETAL might be a variation on that. No intro or conclusion is needed for an 8-mark question. They're only wasting time on the exam if they're trying to introduce it. So they might as well just get straight down into their points. The general consensus, and I don't have any evidence for this, but I was talking about it with my head of department only earlier today, is minimum 4 points. 5 if you want to be sure that they're going to make all their points are good. So 4 to 5 well-explained points. And in terms of structuring, if they think of it as 1 paragraph per point, that helps them to know how many points they've got. The way I tell my students is when they quote, put the quote in quotation marks and then translate whatever they've quoted in brackets. And that makes sure that they're covering that aspect of making sure that they're showing they know what the Latin means. They should try and cover the whole passage. This phrase, style is the handmaiden of content, was told to me by an ex-colleague, and I think it's great. Basically, some students are so concerned with using these technical terms that they forget to talk about what is actually going on in the passage. So by saying style is the handmaiden of content, style should be explaining and supporting the content. They should go for content first, and then if it happens that the point they're making has some alliteration in, or if it happens that the point they're making, the key word in that point is at the end of the line in a promoted position, in an emphatic position, then that's great. But they need to start with content, not thinking, oh, my point, I'm going to make a point about sibilance, even though you can't think of anything relevant to say about the fact that there is sibilance. The bullet points can be useful to guide what they need to talk about. And instead of writing a plan, I would recommend they just highlight the things they want to talk about and annotate the text in front of them, because that's quicker and they don't have much time. So I thought if everyone's still happy with time, just to have a look at a question and think about how you might go about answering that. So this is a question on the current Aeneid text. I thought I'd pick the Aeneid because probably of all the texts, that's the one that most people know and most people will be teaching. And this is what I gave my year 11s as their mock question last month. And I thought it was a particularly nice question because it's the bit of major propaganda in book 6 where he's going, here is the man who is often promised to you, Augustus Caesar, son of a god, who will bring the golden age, with the golden age, which was once ruled over by Saturn in Latium, and will extend the empire beyond the Garamantes and the Indians. The land lies beyond the stars, etc., etc. So it's a really big propaganda passage. How does Virgil, by his use of language, emphasize the grandeur and glory of Rome's future in this prophecy? So I don't know if anyone wants to pick out any points and think about what they would do with them. bit of audience participation, maybe? Don't know, does anyone want to?
I don't mind speaking about this. I'm feeling quite smug because I just did this passage today, so I feel like I have loads of ideas.
Amazing, go for it.
He obviously talks about, the extent of the empire, of what it's going to be. It's going to lie beyond the stars, beyond the path of the year and of the sun. So you've got some nice hyperbolic statements brought out by our anaphora of extra, extra.
Okay. And how does that emphasize the grandeur and glory?
Well, obviously Rome is going to have a great, huge empire. So
okay, so you've got that explanation in there. You've quoted some Latin. You've made it a style point by talking about the anaphora, the repetition of extra. And you've talked about, you've brought in the fact that it's extending the empire. Excellent. Anyone else want to make a point?
Well, there's the cosmic language, lots of stars and heaven, sky, stars, earth, stars.
How does that emphasize the grandeur and glory of Rome's future?
Well, this is sort of epic, very grand language.
But does the fact that he's using grand language emphasize the glory of Rome's future? I would require a little bit more on that to get a really well-developed point.
Yes, okay.
I'd say valid point, but what about this is actually linking to Rome's future glory? I'm agreeing that they're grand language, it's grand language.
Well, that grandeur mimics the Roman grandeur.
Okay, so actually to using really epic language, grand vocabulary is mimicking the grandeur that's to come. Yeah, I'd buy that. Anything else? Take a final point.
How about the very start, hic vir, hic est?
Yeah.
It's very, you've got the anaphora of hic, they're very short phrases, and then following up with, naming him Augustus Caesar, sort of focusing in very much on how he is the central figure, in bringing the Roman Empire to this grandeur that is going to be talked about. And then you might want to then also explain, I'd probably quote hic vir hic est and translate, but then you might also want to kind of cover the content of the rest of the line, saying that he's been, how often he's been promised, that you've heard he's been promised to you as well. Maybe translate the whole line actually.
Yeah, probably. I would probably say you're right. You take it bit by bit rather than writing the whole sort of line and a half and then translating it, because all you're going to do then is go back and have to pick out individual words anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things my some of my pupils find is that how much to translate or how little, and I think sometimes that's a difficult choice, but you can, perhaps it's easier to translate the whole line and then pick out the individual points that you want to make. It's one of the difficulties.
I think arguably, yeah, if you don't need to then quote the entire line in Latin, then translate the entire line in Latin, then pick out the individual Latin words that you've already talked about. Maybe you could translate the whole line and then pick out the Latin words, because otherwise you're just repeating yourself.
Yeah, and that's the trouble, and you don't have that much room or time to really do that. So it's a bit of a kind of quick decision-making moment as to how you do that. I think it's one of the things that they find challenging here.
Yeah, no, I agree. So I think trying to get them in the habit of quoting as little as possible, so that they're only referring to that bit, and then they can always build on it by quoting another thing. This is also shown by whatever the next bit is. For example, I actually took that example and then I thought I'd give you a poorly written answer, because I get a lot of answers that make me think, yeah, okay, but you need to push this a bit further. So I got this point. In the phrase hic vir hic est, Virgil repeats hic to signify Augustus Immortus. The repetition emphasizes who Augustus is and therefore shows the glory of Rome's future. What is wrong with this point?
I think I'd probably say that you haven't embedded it enough in the content of the rest of the line. You need to show more about, you know, what it's saying about Augustus and why he's so important.
Yeah, that why is he so important? Embed it in content and context. Yeah, anything else?
It's just the link between the specific quotation. Hic, where like the repetition of hic does not signify Augustus's importance. It, you know, it might be a small part of a larger point, but the correlation is not direct between the quotation and the point that they're making. They need more explanation.
Yeah, they've gone straight from, oh, here's my point because I annotated this in my text when we did it in class, and there's the answer to the question. And they probably instinctively know how it links. They know that it's drawing attention to him, but they're not saying it. So they're missing out this crucial link between the point they're making and the example they've chosen and the linking to the question, saying this is answering the question. I tried.
And then they're not actually translating it fully. It's almost like, I know because they're easy words, it might seem almost obvious, but although the candidate says who Augustus is, they're not actually specifically giving the English translation of those 4 words there.
Yeah, that candidate needs to get into the habit of everything he quotes, he needs to translate. So I tried to rewrite this as a better point. You can agree or disagree as to whether you think it is the better point. So I tried to sort of color code it by examples, points, evaluation and link. So here, I've translated it. Virgil repeats hic to signify Augustus' importance. Fine, but you need to explain this. It's impossible to imagine Anchises physically pointing out Augustus's shade to Aeneas, repeating himself in his excitement and desire to make sure that Aeneas knows exactly who he is talking about. Augustus is a key person Virgil wishes to praise and credits him with establishing a golden age. So my top candidate is then linking to another bit of quotation. So by drawing attention to this particular figure, he's glorifying Rome through glorifying the person who's going to make it particularly great. So yeah, you were talking about it's not grounding it in any kind of content of who Augustus is and why he's important. So this person is then explaining that. It's explaining why the repeating is actually showing his importance because he's physically pointing him out. He's excited, so he's repeating himself. So I think that would be an example of how you could even do this with your classes. You could get a poorly written example. Maybe don't take it from anyone in the class because they might be offended, and then rewrite it or get them to rewrite it. Giving full detail. So that could be an activity that you could do to improve the quality of the points. So just finally, because I realize I'm going on quite a lot, I thought, what sort of activities can you do to combat things that students find hard with these questions? So I thought some common examples. But first of all, giving examples. We've talked about it. Quotes are too long, they don't translate it. My lot, I often find their quotes and translations don't match. So they quote something and then the translation is just like, oh, you don't actually know what this means, or you don't know what this bit of Latin is. And then their chosen quote doesn't really support the point. So you think, that's a really great point. If only you'd picked something else to talk about it with. So any suggestions for what you could do in class to help them with quotations and the examples?
I have started an exercise every single lesson. We look over some of the old texts and find hook words, as I call them. And I use on the left the Latin, on the right the English. So we need them in English and in Latin, and then they need to revise that over the week because I only see them once a week. And the next week, I give them a sheet of the same passage but blank, where they need to highlight again the English and the Latin like together, and then explain to me why we said that was a hook word. For example, in the Caesar, something about the hasta being thrown and so on, and then they know that hasta means spear, which then triggers it that the message was brought to the other people. So, you know, like short translations, they need to highlight both, and then always like hook a bit of information onto that so that they know a little bit more than just the Latin or English.
I really love that idea. I'm going to do that or something similar. And just, yeah, picking out the things that you're actually most likely to talk about. And then
Exactly, because they were really struggling, and we had appalling marks in both. We've done 2 sets of mocks, and so we're now spoon feeding a little bit, but we're spending I don't know, like a third of every lesson on doing hook words, and they actually love it, and it's beautiful and colorful, and that way they can visualize it a bit better. And so it's, I don't know, like they get 3 things out of 1 exercise: the Latin, the English, and that extra bit of information. So if they see a passage and they, I have no idea what that means, but I recognize castra, then something comes from that, for example.
I think that's really good. Thank you. Any other suggestions? Well, the only suggestion I had, not a terribly interesting one compared to, but I've got a grid for when they do their 8-mark questions, they could practice it that looks like this. So instead of just writing an essay, they've got to be like, right, I'm making 5 points, put your point, actually put your evidence in, and then put your explanation. So they're actually being forced to break down what they're writing. You could do a different grid. So you could have a different box for evidence. And yeah, but that kind of thing could work. My second one was over-reliance on technical jargon. You've got sort of nonsense like the alliteration of turbant trepida, the trembling waters of the Nile are disturbed, which isn't even a correct translation of that, shows that the Nile is scared and so glorifies Rome. I mean, really? The polysyndeton of et shows the extent of Rome's future empire. I mean, no, the word and doesn't show anything at all. It's the words in between the et, but they're so focused on the fact that there are lots of ets that they think that that is what is the most important thing to talk about. So students need to explain how these technical terms support their points. Any suggestions for that?
I think it's similar to how you had it laid out in a grid, but I try and get my pupils like using the 2 kind of prompts. So yours was, you know, about the grandeur of Rome and the mention of Augustus and the extent of the empire, is I get them to write 5 points without even using any Latin, just about the English. So like, what is going on in this passage? And then write your 5 points without engaging with the actual Latin, because yeah, otherwise they're starting, like you say, with the style rather than with the content.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. Anything else? I have something really horrible that they can do. So yeah, that's the same as what you were saying, Rachel. Look at content first and then see the style. It must think about whether it's actually answering the question, because if you're just talking about something that isn't relevant, there's no point. And then I get them to explain their points without using certain terms that they really love. So could you answer a question without talking about drama, vivid, emphasis, strong, imagery? Could they actually do it? Could they manage to explain it without, when they're not allowed to use these style terms at all? Because then they're being forced. I mean, things like drama or vivid, dramatic, vivid. What does that even mean? So they're going to have to think about it in a slightly different way. Problems with not answering the question. So I would just link to the question, stress that bit, that's a really important part of what they're doing. Highlighting keywords in the question and include them in each paragraph. It can be a bit boring if every single paragraph is got the word dramatic or exciting in, but if you've got weaker students, that might be what you need to do. If you've got stronger students, they should be able to use synonyms, they should be able to express it in different ways. Rachel, did you want to?
I was going to say, I think the problem is also the link between these two issues. One, overusing words like vivid, and then not answering the question. Because we as students, if it says, how does he make this passage vivid, we'll just have vivid in every single passage, in every single point they're making, and not actually develop on that. So I think it's difficult getting them to link it to the question, but not just repeating the terminology of the question as their analysis or their link to the question at the end of every point.
Yeah, and it might be that individual students have different things. Like one student might need to actually have something explicit where it links to the question. Another student might need to work on that bridging, that actual explanation of how it links to the question. So, I mean, none of these things are going to solve all the problems in one thing. I do think students have a bit of a temptation to regurgitate their notes without considering the relevance. If they've been revising, they just sort of think, oh, we've said all this stuff about a particular page, I'm going to write it down because that's the passage we've got, and they're not actually thinking about the question. Any suggestions on that? I think it's a really tricky one, actually. I'm not sure that I've really really solved that myself. Maybe, I mean, I think I teach it really traditionally in that I go through the text and go through translation, go through style, they annotate their text. I wonder whether instead of just annotating the text for anything of interest, we need to look at text in terms of the questions that could be asked about it. So then they're never looking at style without thinking about an overarching question on that section. Because there are some sections where, I mean, that section of the Aeneid I gave you, what else could you ask about it apart from how does Virgil glorify Rome or something like that? All the points there are going to be focused on that. So if there happens to be some alliteration that doesn't glorify Rome, what's the point of it? What's the point of mentioning it? So maybe that's something I need to do more of, is just make sure that I'm focusing on particular themes for particular sections. Could be.
One method to sort of combat that is perhaps giving them the passage and asking them what question you'd ask. And then design a bullet point mark scheme or something to answer it.
Yeah, and I'm going to wrap this up now because the last point was timing. And I think I am guilty of spending too long, perhaps. So all I would say is for timing, they have got 10 minutes. If they answer all the short questions quickly, then they've got longer on it. But they need to know their text well if they're going to do it. So that's all from me. I'm sorry I've run on a little bit, but thank you, and thank you to everyone who has contributed. If you like, I've got some resources that I could share with people. If I'm sure we could arrange, I can put them in a zip file and somehow share them.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Rosalind. I think Grania is really keen to share resources around. So if possible, after the session, if you wouldn't mind sharing your PowerPoint perhaps, or anything else that you are happy to share, I can then pass that on. And I think Grania is going to share the recording and any resources when she's back from leave. So thank you so much. That was really great. I think David is kindly going to talk to us. David teaches at Kelmscott School in London and is just going to talk to us briefly, and then we're going to hear from Sarah, who's just joined us from Channing School as well. So David, I think I've made you co-host now, so hopefully you should be able to share your screen.
Okay, I'm just going to try. Can you see my screen?
Not yet, but it sometimes takes a moment.
Because if not, I'll just.
If not, I can bring it. Oh, there we go. I can see it now. Can others see that? Great. I think we're away, David.
Okay, great. So I'm just going to give a quick rundown of how I teach a 10 marker kind of how to approach it. The top band students will give a logical, well-developed, sustained and coherent answer. And so I'm kind of approaching this with the idea that they've read the text, they know it really well. So just how do they then put those ideas into a good order so that they open up that highest boundary. I think it's really important with this question that we show massive enthusiasm for it. I think it's the best question really in the exam paper in lots of ways, because it actually gives the students a chance to express their own thoughts about something. I think the exam's quite restrictive in getting students to give a kind of personal response to this, which is hard because it's a good exam to give engagement with. So I think if we enthuse them, they should be enthusiastic about this question as well. I mean, regardless of the fact it's worth, 20% of the whole paper in literature, I think it's a really good opportunity for them to finish the exam in a really strong and positive way. One of my other tips as well, though, before teaching this would be if your classics is your main job, then to go and speak to your English department. My main job is as an English teacher, and the questions that turn up in the 10 marker are very similar to the GCSE questions that appear in both language questions and literature questions. So your English department might have some ways or methods that they teach your students to engage with these questions in their exams, and it would maybe make sense to kind of magpie and take their methods into your classics lessons, so that students are using a method for writing an extended piece of writing that they're used to doing in another subject. So just on this slide here are 3 questions from the AQA GCSE syllabus, and if you can see them, they kind of have similar sort of goals to the 10 marker. I do think it's worth planning some sort of response to this question, because again, to go back to the keywords of the top bands, it has to be logical, it has to be well developed, it has to be sustained, and it has to be coherent. And I think if students kind of just go into a writing frenzy, they won't hit those kind of boundaries. They won't cross those boundaries, because they haven't given themselves a chance to be logical and to sustain and develop an idea. And I think where this could be really useful is with just a little small introduction as well. I try to get my students to write me an introduction where it says kind of what an overall opinion about the question is, and then what they're going to tell me. So for example, if the question was asking them about how a character might be presented as, to what extent do you think they are presented as a hero in this text, I might ask them to kind of write down what they consider to be heroic qualities themselves, so they know what they're going to be looking for, and then what they're going to criticize in the text, and to order those ideas. So they might say something along the lines of, I'm going to start by looking at how Paris is presented, then Agamemnon, and conclude by looking at how Achilles is viewed in this extract. I'm just making something up there. But I think it's a nice way of them telling themselves what they're going to tell me. But also, if we're going to do a logical, well-developed and sustained piece of writing, I think it's a nice way to tell the examiner, this is what I'm going to tell you. And then the examiner is looking out for that information coming, and in a sense, if they tell the examiner that's what they're going to tell them, and then they tell them, then it's hard to argue that it's not a logical, well-developed piece of writing. As far as the structure of the overall piece of writing goes, I try to get my students to kind of think in 5 paragraphs, and the introduction should count in some way towards that. I try to get them to think of an overview of the whole text for a start. Then I try to get them to think in either 2 ways. I think chronological is one way to do it. So they're trying to work through different moments in the texts that they think show different angles to their answer. So it's no good giving me 3 examples of the same point from 3 different parts of the text. I want them to work through the text chronologically to show where maybe differences to the previous point are being made. The other way to work through it is if you have like lots of characters in a text, is maybe to then focus on your paragraphs in a character format. So, you know, Paris may be present throughout the whole text. So give me an overview in a paragraph about Paris, and then in the next paragraph, give me an overview of Agamemnon, and then in that next paragraph, give me a view of Achilles. And then I think it's worth at the end giving that conclusion where you say, look, I told you I was going to tell you about this stuff. I have now told you about this stuff. And now I think I've made the point of, and what did you think you were going to make the point of? Because you've said it in the introduction and you've then reiterated that in your conclusion. And my kind of final bit of advice to students is, I think giving them practice papers before the exam is really useful, obviously. But wherever possible, I try to get the students to push themselves to think outside the box. And I do try to encourage them to make as many kind of what I guess would be reception links to ideas as possible. Think about where they might see these characters in modern times and try to address that, and in as much as by then challenging that back into an ancient world scenario. So, you know, what is our idea of masculinity, for example, but does that match what an ancient idea of masculinity would be? And I do encourage students to give those opinions where they have the time to develop a personal response in the question, because I think it's important that the students feel like they're not boxed in by what is expected of them to be written, but they're given a chance to show what they really think about the text. I did try to get my past papers to see if I could give some examples on here, but I wasn't able to get hold of them. But I do think it's really important as well, like after the exam, and I guess I'm saying something quite obvious here, as soon as you can get hold of your past papers, get them and have a look at what went well and what didn't as far as this question goes, because, you know, I think I have a good method. I've got some good marks for this question from students that have done it in the past. I guess I'd like the evidence in front of me to show you, but I don't have that, unfortunately. And that's kind of the end of my 10-mark summary.
Oh, thanks very much, David. I think I don't know if anyone's got any input there, but I just thought it's really useful, your comment about the English approach. And I used to be an English teacher as well, and just like if your English teachers department are teaching an approach, whether it's like the peel or the petal or whatever like that, it's kind of good perhaps to mirror that in your Latin teaching. Just it might give you a bit of a head start. Did anyone have any questions for David there? Okay, we might, I'm just conscious of time. We've got 15 minutes. So I'm going to hand over to Sarah, who's really kindly joined us from Channing School. And unfortunately, we are going to have to finish kind of quite bang on time, just because the A-level session starts at 5 on this Zoom link. Well, on a separate Zoom link, but I need to start that one off. So Sarah, over to you.
Yeah, that's no problem. I can't share my screen yet, so I think you need to make me co-host.
Oh, yeah.
I'm also talking about the 10 marker, but so about all the sort of activities you can do around it. So hopefully there won't be too much overlap.
Fantastic. Sarah, I think you should be able to now.
Okay. Just give me a second. It's being a little bit awkward. We did practice this. I'm a Google Meet person, and we've done all our online teaching that way. So I'm just trying to work out how to. It's not working like it was before.
Have you got that share screen, the big green button down the bottom? Is it not?
I have, but it's saying I'm just going to go to system preferences and look at what's the bit I need to look at. Sorry, everyone, just give me a second. Security and privacy. Okay, I don't think it's going to allow me to show my presentation. So what I'll do is I'll just talk through it and give you an idea of the sort of things that we do. I attended the OCR inset, Ask the Examiner, and that was really good. And a few takeaways from that were things like a range of points is crucial. Students must go beyond the passages in the paper and address all authors if the question demands it. This was John Dance, who was excellent, and he advises 12 minutes, 4 to 5 paragraphs. But I think, as Rosalind said, if they can whack out the quick questions really quickly, then that gives them more time to spend on the 10 marker. One thing about the 10 marker that I think hasn't been said so far is there are no points for style questions, for style points. So if they start talking about, oh, it's a great, he engages the author by the way he uses alliteration, that's not going to work really with the examiner. What my students often ask is, should they quote? So should they quote the English? And what the examiner, what John said was, it is really good if they can quote, but a detailed paraphrase is absolutely fine. And what I often say to my students is, if it's in front of you, quote. If it's not, a detailed paraphrase is fine. The examiner's reports are always worth looking at. They say aim for 6 detailed points, and as David said, really engage with the question. So on the Virgil paper this year, it was all about human interest, and a lot of the students really didn't look at the idea of what makes for human interest. And then something that also happens quite a lot, particularly when it's the Odyssey or the Aeneid, and students have read other books of the Odyssey or the Aeneid, there's not much credit for going outside the set text. So even if they know lots about Odysseus and Nausicaa, that's not going to really help when you're dealing with sort of Odysseus and Circe, for example. So things that I do to get ideas flowing. I do lots with post-its. So I trained at King's London, where Aisha was really great on using post-its, because they don't feel they're committing it to their actual exercise book or document. And the sort of the temporary nature of them means they're really good. We get supersized ones that you can get on the internet. We also use something called Jamboard. I don't know if anyone's familiar with Jamboard. It's part of the Google Suite. And this is where you put a question and they log in. We're a Google school, so we use all the Google applications, and they can do lots of different post-its to show their different thoughts. We also do what is quite, so I've been doing a lot of work on cognitive science this year, so we've been doing a lot on retrieval practice, and there's something called the brain dump, which is always a little bit scatological. Free recall is another way of doing it, and getting them just to jot down all their ideas. So we did one on fathers and sons in the Aeneid. We did that last year for Aeneid too, and we got them to just get down everything they knew. You can scaffold that one, so you can put text in and images in, and that's quite useful as well. I also do a lot with knowledge organisers. I've really got into these. I got into these for the GCSE class Civ because there's so much material. And so I boil it down, a text down to a single side of A4. And I have all the key plots, all the key character points. And then I always have a section which is called possible 10 markers. And we won't have time to do all of them in class, but they're expected to do mind maps for all of them. So they're the sort of things that we do to get the ideas flowing. We then workshop the technique. So we start off with one of the idea flowing ideas, and then we'd have like a Google slide presentation. We have all the possible points. Then we'll go into a practice question, and then we'll do some peer assessment and get them to work out if they really have done 5 marks AO2, 5 marks AO3. Although it's, as they say, they're advising 6 points rather than 5, but that's the sort of thing to think about. We use model answers a lot. So we've requested quite a few papers back from OCR, which is really good. And then OCR on the website, I'm sure everyone knows, have the 2019 candidate exemplars. And it's really good to give those to students and for them to mark them and work out where the AO2 is, where the AO3 is, and that. We do lots of model introductions and conclusions because we think this is really important for the coherence of the argument. And so we've got a big bank of resources with those. And that's about it, I guess. I have tons of resources that I've not been able to show you, all my pictures, so I might see if I can send that to you as a follow-up later. So does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, I'm really sorry about the technical issues there.
Okay, I thought,
Not sure why.
I don't know why.
We've been practiced it earlier, didn't we?
We practiced it 2 o'clock this afternoon. I don't know what's happened, but it's fine. I'll send the slides around. People can ask.
Could I ask? Could I ask something?
Sorry, go for it.
Right.
Yeah.
How do you use? You mentioned about post-its. How do you use the post-its? Do you get them to write a point on the post-it?
Yeah, lots of different ideas. So you can do it where they write 1 point and then you do smaller post-its for this one. So 1 point and then they come and put them on the board, or they do on a bigger post-it a mind map. And then we love visualizers at my school. So we've got an IPEVO visualizer. So what I'll do is when they've got their mind map or their suggested points on the big post-its, we'll then put that under the visualizer and have a look as a class at what's been mentioned, what's been left out, what could be more developed. But it's just for the initial planning and the getting of ideas going.
Okay, thanks.
I had a question as well. You were saying at the beginning of that they had to mention all the texts if there was more than one author.
If the question demands it.
Okay, because we're doing the Apuleius and the Cicero, and they seem
Quite
like really
good.
quite different texts. Like,
Yeah.
Could you get a 10 marker just on the Cicero? It's really short. Like,
yeah, you can, oh no, not a 10 mark on the Pythias, I don't think. No.
So you
could ask a question such as, how do the authors engage the audience in their storytelling?
Yeah.
And that's where you could bring the Cicero and the Pythias and the Apuleius in.
So you'd have to bring both in there because it's
If
saying
the
how do the
question
authors.
says, yeah. John at the OCR inset was quite clear on that. Yes.
Yeah, great, thank you, because my students were asking about that.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree with David. I do think the 10 marker is a fantastic opportunity, often at the end of the exam, not always at the end of the exam. Sometimes they put it a little bit early and students think that's the end. So it's really important that they realize it doesn't just have to come at the end, but I do think it's a really nice way of them showing off what they know and understand at this part in the paper.